To understand the sheer terror of what the Canadian Artillery Corps achieved in the final year of the Second World War, you first have to understand the noise of battle. War, by 1944, had a rhythm. It had a predictable, albeit terrifying, soundtrack. If an attack was coming, you knew about it days in advance. The enemy would begin softening up your positions. Shells would whistle overhead, exploding in ones or twos, bracketing your trenches as they found their range. Then, the drum fire would begin, a steady, rolling thunder of high explosives designed to keep your head down while the infantry advanced. It was horrifying, it was destructive, but it gave you a chance. When you heard that first distant thump and the subsequent shriek of incoming steel, you had perhaps 3 or 4 seconds to dive into a dugout, press your body against the earth, and pray. You had a warning. The German Wehrmacht, the masters of the Blitzkrieg, understood this rhythm implicitly. Their veterans, hardened on the frozen steppes of Russia and the burning sands of North Africa, knew artillery. They respected it, but they didn't fear it with the supernatural dread they would come to associate with the Canadians. By late 1944 and early 1945, in the muddy, frozen wastes of the Rhineland and the waterlogged polders of the Netherlands, German commanders sitting in their reinforced concrete bunkers felt relatively secure. They looked at their maps and dismissed the Canadian forces opposite them. To the aristocratic Prussian officers who still dominated the German high command, the Canadians were colonials. They were viewed as brave, certainly, perhaps even reckless in infantry assault, but they were considered unsophisticated in the grand science of warfare. The Germans believed these North Americans lacked the discipline for complex, large-scale coordination. More importantly, the German intelligence officers listening to the airwaves heard nothing that alarmed them. Radio traffic was the lifeblood of modern warfare. A major offensive was usually preceded by a chaotic spike in radio chatter, orders flying back and forth, frantic calls for supplies, the nervous energy of an army about to jump off. But listening to the Canadian sector was boring. It was quiet. The transmissions they did intercept seemed innocuous, almost bureaucratic. They heard meteorological reports, endless strings of numbers detailing wind speed at different altitudes, barometric pressure readings, and temperature gradients. They heard surveyors calling out coordinates in flat, monotone voices. They heard requests for new tires for trucks or more fuse-setting keys. It sounded like the administrative humming of an army in winter quarters, not an army preparing for an apocalypse. The German generals, sipping ersatz coffee in their warm command posts miles behind the front line, interpreted this quiet as inactivity. They were smug. They believed they knew exactly where the Canadian guns were. They believed that if an attack came, their own formidable 88s and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers would have plenty of time to return fire before the Allied infantry got too close. They were catastrophically wrong. What the Germans interpreted as quiet bureaucracy was, in fact, the sound of the most sophisticated, mathematical killing machine the world had ever seen being fine-tuned. The silence wasn't inactivity. It was discipline. The mundane radio traffic wasn't administrative clutter. It was the raw data required for a new kind of warfare. The Canadians had mastered a technique that changed the fundamental rules of artillery, the time-on-target barrage, or TOT. It was a concept so deceptively simple in theory, yet so mind-bendingly complex in execution that few armies could pull it off without killing their own men. Here is the problem with traditional artillery. If you have 1,000 guns spread out over 20 miles of front line, and you order them all to fire at the same target at the same time, the shells will arrive in a ragged, staggered sequence. A 5.5-inch medium gun firing from 10 miles away has a much longer flight time than a 25-pounder field gun firing from 4 miles away. The sound of the nearer guns firing warns the enemy target long before the heavy stuff arrives from the rear. The surprise is lost. The time-on-target mission turned this dynamic on its head. Instead of synchronizing the time the guns fired, the Canadians synchronized the time the shells arrived. To achieve this, The Canadian Royal Artillery had to transform itself from a collection of rough-and-tumble gun crews into a massive, open-air physics laboratory. Behind the lines, in muddy tents lit by kerosene lamps, teams of highly trained mathematicians, often former university professors or accountants wearing uniforms, worked feverishly on artillery boards. They weren't just plotting points on a map. They were calculating four-dimensional geometry in their heads. Every single gun in the Canadian Corps, from the nimble 25-pounders right up to the monstrous 7.2-inch howitzers that fired shells the size of a small car, had to be calibrated. The gunners needed to know the exact wear on the barrel rifling, because a worn barrel shoots slightly slower. They needed to know the temperature of the cordite propellant charges, because cold gunpowder burns slower than warm gunpowder. And then there was the weather. This was the data the Germans had heard on the radio and dismissed. A shell fired at a high angle into the stratosphere might encounter 100-mile-an-hour crosswinds 5 miles up, while the air at ground level was dead calm. The Canadian meteorologists were sending up weather balloons every few hours, building a three-dimensional model of the atmosphere over the battlefield. All this data, barrel wear, charge temperature, wind speed, air density, the rotation of the Earth, was fed into the command tents. There, the plotters crunched the numbers. They had to calculate backward. If H-hour, the moment of impact, was exactly 06 hours, they had to tell the heavy gun 10 miles back to fire at exactly 05:58 or 12. They had to tell the medium gun 5 miles back to fire at 05:59:04. And they had to tell the field gun just behind the front line to fire at 05:59:38. For days leading up to a major operation like Operation Veritable in the Reichswald forest, the Canadian sector was a hive of silent, frantic activity. This was the logistical iceberg beneath the surface. To fire 1,000 guns for hours required mountains of ammunition. Convoys of trucks, running without headlights in the pitch black of night, moved thousands of tons of high explosives from railheads to camouflage dumps near the gun pits. The gun crews, stripped to their undershirts despite the freezing mud, worked until their hands bled, cleaning shells, setting fuses, and digging trails for the guns to handle the recoil. And all the while, the radios remained disciplined. The true nature of the impending violence was hidden behind code words. A single target might be designated by a simple code, like Victor 34. A request for a massive, core-level strike on that target wouldn't be a screaming order. It would be a calm request for a Mike target or a Victor target at a specific time. The Germans, listening in, heard only the calm voices of men discussing numbers. They didn't hear the tension. They didn't see the artillery brigadier standing in his command post, looking at his watch, holding a microphone like a conductor's baton. This brigadier wasn't just an officer. He was the maestro of an orchestra of death. His instruments were huge cannons of steel and iron, spread across miles of landscape, hidden in forests, behind barns, and in the ruins of bombed-out villages. The tension in the gun pits in the final hours before a TOT was excruciating. The crews would stand by their guns, the massive shells resting on loading trays. The layers, the men who aimed the guns, would stare at their dial sights, making microscopic adjustments to the elevation and traverse, ensuring the bubbles on their spirit levels were dead center. They knew the coordinates they had been given down to the yard. They trusted the math. They trusted the voices on the radio. Imagine the scene. It's 05:55 in the morning, pitch black, cold. 1,000 gun crews are standing silent, breaths pluming in the freezing air. The radio operators in 1,000 different pits have their headphones on, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the time signal, synchronized to the second across the entire army. In the deep rear, the order is quietly given. The heaviest guns, the ones with the longest flight times, roar to life first. Great jets of orange flame stab into the night sky, and massive projectiles begin their long, arcing climb into the stratosphere. A minute later, miles closer to the front, the medium regiments receive their time check. 100 more guns fire in unison, their shells chasing the first ones through the dark sky. Finally, just behind the infantry lines, the 25-pounders bark into action. To an observer standing near the guns, it would seem chaotic. Just a series of unrelated bangs scattered across the landscape over the course of 2 minutes. It didn't sound like a coordinated attack. It just sounded like sporadic, harassing fire. But physics was taking over. High above the battlefield, invisible in the darkness, tons of steel and high explosives were converging. Shells traveling at supersonic speeds were overtaking slower shells. They were battling crosswinds, riding the thin air of the upper atmosphere and beginning their terminal descent. The math was working, the parabolas were aligning. Miles away, in that warm German bunker, the general might be reaching for his coffee cup. The sentry in the trench outside might be lighting a cigarette, grateful for a quiet night. The radio operator might be yawning, noting another boring meteorological report from the Canadians. They hear nothing. No whistle, no incoming shriek. The shells are traveling faster than the speed of sound. The first warning they will have that the Canadians have stopped being quiet is the instant they cease to exist. The air above the target area is currently empty. In 30 seconds, it will be occupied by 1,000 heavy artillery shells, all arriving at the exact same fraction of a second. The conductor has raised his baton. The symphony is about to begin. The instant of impact was not a noise. It was a physical event, a discontinuity in the atmosphere. For the German soldiers in the target zone, there was no crescendo, no building roar of approaching death. One moment, there was the stillness of the pre-dawn dark. The next, the sky itself collapsed. 1,000 shells, ranging from high-explosive fragmentation rounds to deep-penetrating heavy howitzer shells, detonated within a single second. The Earth didn't just shake, it liquefied. The physics of a time-on-target strike creates a phenomenon known as overpressure. When a single shell explodes, it creates a shockwave. When 1,000 shells explode simultaneously in a confined grid square, those shockwaves collide and compound. They create a crushing wall of air pressure that moves faster than the shrapnel itself. In that first second, bunkers that were rated to withstand direct hits were cracked open like eggshells by the sheer atmospheric hammer blow. The air was sucked out of lungs. Eardrums ruptured instantly. The forest canopy, the trees, the barbed wire, and the trenches were simply erased, replaced by a sudden towering geyser of fire and dirt that rose hundreds of feet into the air. Then came the sound. It was described by those who heard it not as a rumble, but as a single, catastrophic crack, like the snapping of a cosmic whip, followed immediately by a rolling, continuous roar that sounded like a freight train driving through the center of the earth. This was the stonk. This was the murder. These were the grim slang terms the Canadian gunners used for what they had just unleashed. For the German survivors, if there were any, the world had ended. The psychological impact of a TOT barrage was arguably more effective than the physical destruction. Veteran Wehrmacht officers, men who had survived the meat grinder of Stalingrad and the relentless pounding of the Eastern Front, were found wandering in a daze, bleeding from the nose and ears, unable to speak, unable to hold a weapon, completely stripped of their will to fight. They had been prepared for battle. They had not been prepared for instant annihilation. The arrogance of the German High Command, who had dismissed the quiet Canadians as amateurs, had been vaporized along with their forward defenses. But the genius of the Canadian artillery doctrine wasn't just in the opening sledgehammer blow. It was in what happened next. The TOT was just the opening act. As the dust from that first massive impact was still settling, the creeping barrage began. This was a technique refined by Canadians in the First World War and perfected in the Second. It was a moving wall of fire. The gunners adjusted their aim. Every 3 minutes, they would lift their elevation by exactly 100 yards. The line of exploding shells would step forward, pacing out a rhythm of destruction. And behind this curtain of death walked the Canadian infantry. They were taught to lean into the barrage. It was a terrifying act of trust. The infantrymen would walk so close to their own exploding shells that they could feel the heat of the blasts and smell the cordite. They did this because they knew that the moment the barrage moved forward, the German defenders would still be keeping their heads down. By hugging the fire, the Canadians could be on top of the enemy trenches before the Germans even knew the shelling had stopped. This coordination required a level of communication that was light years ahead of anything the Germans possessed. The Canadian Artillery Radio Network was the Internet of 1945. It was a flexible, responsive nervous system that connected the lowliest private with a radio on his back to the massive guns 10 miles in the rear. Consider the terrifying efficiency of the Mike target. This was the code for a regiment-sized strike. A forward observation officer, or FOO, lying in a muddy ditch with a pair of binoculars, might spot a German counterattack forming up in a woodblock. He would key his microphone. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't panic. He would simply say, "Mike target, grid 455233. Within seconds, that request was relayed to 24 guns. The plotting officers did the math in moments. The gun layers spun their wheels. And within 45 seconds of the request being made, 24 rounds were in the air. But if the target was bigger, if it was a panzer division assembling for a breakthrough, the FU would call for a Victor target. That was the code for every gun in the Corps. That meant 600 to 1,000 guns. When a Victor target was called, the entire horizon behind the Canadian lines would light up with a continuous sheet of artificial lightning. The sound was so intense that gunners would bleed from their ears even with protection. The ground would vibrate so violently that compasses became useless. And at the other end of that trajectory, a grid square of the Earth was simply deleted. This happened during Operation Veritable in the Reichswald Forest in February 1945. The Canadians unleashed the largest artillery barrage in the history of the British Army to that point. They utilized a tactic called pepper potting. It wasn't just the big guns. They integrated anti-aircraft guns, anti-tank guns, and even tank cannons into the barrage, firing them indirectly over the heads of the infantry to saturate the area. The Germans in the forest didn't just face explosions, they faced a blizzard of steel. Captured German intelligence reports from this period reveal a deep, terrifying confusion. German soldiers, when interrogated, asked to see the automatic artillery. They refused to believe that human crews could load and fire bolt-action cannons that fast, with that much accuracy. They were convinced the Canadians had developed some kind of belt-fed robotic howitzer. They couldn't comprehend that the speed came from the sweat and muscle of men working in perfect, drilled unison, stripping to the waist in the freezing rain, handling 100-pound shells like they were toys, driven by a math so precise it seemed like magic. There is a famous story of a German general captured in the Hochwald Gap. He was a proud man, a Prussian aristocrat with an iron cross at his throat. As he was being led to the rear, he stopped and looked back at the battlefield. He saw the smoke rising in perfect geometric lines. He saw the craters spaced with mathematical exactitude. He turned to his Canadian captor and asked, "Where are your belt-fed cannons? I must see them." The Canadian soldier just laughed. "We don't have belt-fed cannons, Fritz," he said. "We just have guys who know their math." This dominance came at a cost. The gunners worked until they dropped. During the great battles of the Rhineland, it was not uncommon for gun barrels to glow cherry red in the night, the steel literally softening from the heat of rapid fire. Men suffered from gunner's tremor, a neurological condition caused by the constant concussive force of the blasts. They went deaf. They developed hernias from heaving shells for 12 hours straight, but they never stopped firing. They knew that every shell they fired was a life insurance policy for the infantry walking into the machine guns ahead. By the spring of 1945, the quiet Canadian radio had become the sound the Germans feared most. They learned that when the airwaves went silent, it didn't mean the Canadians were sleeping. It meant they were calculating. It meant the plotters were hunched over their boards, protractors in hand, solving the geometry of death. It meant the meteorologists were checking the wind one last time. The legacy of the Canadian Royal Artillery in World War II is one of supreme professional competence. They didn't have the glamour of the paratroopers or the romantic image of the fighter pilots. They were technicians. They were the king of battles. They turned warfare into an industrial process, removing the variables of luck and replacing them with the certainty of mathematics. When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent for the last time, the silence was different. It wasn't the deceptive, terrifying silence of the pre-dawn wait. It was a true silence. The birds began to sing again in the Reichswald. The smoke drifted away, but the landscape remained changed forever, scarred, cratered, and reshaped by the power of the Canadian guns. The German generals who had sat in their bunkers, mocking the colonials for their lack of radio chatter, had learned a final, fatal lesson. In modern war, the loudest threats aren't the ones screaming over the radio. The most dangerous thing on the battlefield is a Canadian mathematician with a map, a radio, and 1,000 guns waiting for his command. The silence wasn't weakness. It was the deep breath before the scream. And when the scream finally came, it was the last thing the enemy ever heard.